Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Mishik. I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona. I am president of Chapter 12 of United Pool Association out here. Just wanted to say thank you to everybody that's listening to our podcast, and share it with your friends if there's one of these episodes that you like. Steve and I are kind of flying solo. We don't have anybody as a guest on this episode, but we wanted to talk about some stuff that we feel is very important and kind of pertinent in our industry right now. But I do want to say this is our 10th podcast, and we're really happy about that. Bear with us this first year. As we do this is going to be not quite as smooth and streamlined as we had hoped, just as putting out episodes. I was sick last week and just wasn't feeling good, and we're doing one of these a week. So we're just kind of getting this stuff out to you guys, and we appreciate all of your support. As these pop up on your podcast channels and you see them, we just love that the support and the listening. And we even had a member sign up with United Pool Association, I think a week or so ago. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah. Real quick, I'm Steve Homer. I'm the vice president of UPA, and I'm here in Huntington Beach, California. And we had a guy listen to a podcast, I think, with Harold Evans and Eric Knight, because he's a big fan of Arenda, and he liked it. And then a little conversation came up on Jason Broswell's group, the swimming pool industry workers and pool pros only. I got that one
little
right
plug
for the first
there.
time.
Nice.
Yeah, but anyway, so a little conversation popped up, and I called the guy up. Guy's in Rhode Island, had a great conversation. Great guy, hard worker, and we're pleased to have him aboard. It's exciting.
That's awesome. So
today we're going to talk a little bit about. I guess we're going to talk about sanitizer, chlorine, different forms, and some of the trend to get away from stabilized chlorine, and kind of how that benefits people. Because truly, Joe has made himself an expert on this, because he's a guy in Phoenix. I mean, and typically in Phoenix, they're floating half a dozen tabs a week into those pools to make the chlorine last, which takes cyanurics and just shoots them through the roof.
Right.
And that gives you guys just tons of problems there. So Joe was one of the first guys to kind of pioneer using cal-hypo tabs. There's not a whole lot of them made. Distribution doesn't want to carry them because there's a whole different storage procedure they have to follow to have those cal-hypo tabs in the shop. But Joe bought them direct from Lonza, and that is a great tab. I've fooled around with those things a little bit too. It's a tab that you can throw in the skimmer and it'll last a week, which is unheard of. I mean, anything in the skimmer goes away quick.
And they're relatively similar dissolve rate to a trichlor tab. Well, I should say the NST brand that Lonza. In fact, I don't even know what I think they're still Lonza. They got bought out, but I know they're still making the same product. But right. Steve, you're right.
It's a great product. So just switching from trichlor tabs to cal-hypo tabs is no easy feat. It's not. Well, that's I guess it's easy, but you just don't switch tabs. You got to look at all kinds of other things. You got to keep track of a whole host of different parameters in that pool when you switched over to the cal-hypo tab. Joe did it, and Joe worked out the details, which I handed to Joe. That's a lot of work, and he did it quite well. So you did it so well that the cyanurics in your water were going away. You bought conditioner for the first time in 20 years, didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a good intro there, Steve. Thank you. It's a lot to process too, because it does take a lot of work to switch a pool over. And I will say the reason that is, and just to answer your question real quick, Steve, yeah, my cyanurics have dropped. They've plummeted. Trichlor and going out of season, meaning going from summer to winter. We don't really have fall and spring here. It seems like it goes from 100 degrees down to like 80 degrees, which for us is cold. The East Coast thinks 80 degrees is hot, but it seems like it just goes from hot to cold, or hot to whatever, cooler weather. And typically what I would do for a long time, and we could also talk about the history of chlorine a little bit, but what I would do is I would just jump over to liquid, bleach, sodium hypochlorite. Just use that after the summer was over and try to control cyanurics that way. And it does work to a certain degree. I would have pools that would, be as high as 150, 100 parts cyanuric, and you might drop 25% at best over a winter. That's like good case scenario. But then you're going to ramp it back up again the next summer if you don't drain the water or take care of, your levels and taking care of that water. About 5 years ago, I'm going to roll with this a little bit. 5 years ago or so, I remember being over in California. It was actually while I was still part of IPSA, nod to David Hawes there, who we had on last time. By the way, great podcast if you haven't listened to it. But I was over there and they were talking about the drought in California. And that kind of struck a nerve with me, because I'm like, well, if it's happening in California, it's going to make its way to Arizona. That's how things usually trend. And I was just like, okay, water conservation. I live in the desert. I don't want to be draining my pools that often, or at least maybe even taking water out. And that's something that I've actually adopted within the last few years, is trying to drain water out of my pools to monitor the TDS, the cyanuric, and a lot of that stuff. But you can only get so far when you're using certain, controls like dichlor, trichlor, things that have cyanuric in them. So to that, it's about this time last year, well, actually probably at the beginning of last year, 2018, I had done a little bit of research prior to that year, and found, cal-hypo tabs. And there was some tabs that Lonza was making that I had tested that were meant for feeders. So you had to buy the feeder unit, and usually they're pretty pricey. I would say, $300 or $400, at least $200 to $300 our cost at distribution. Upselling that to the customer, trying to get that onto all of my residential pools. I don't have a lot of commercial pools, and that's a whole nother ball of wax, because those you definitely need a feeder on. But with that being said, I ran into the problem with their earlier tabs, or the tabs designed for the feeders, were just dissolving way too quickly if I wasn't using them in a feeder. So I would ramp up my chlorine in the water. Granted that a cal-hypo tab in that form is okay, but I'm putting way too much chlorine in the pool. So then they came out with their NST tab, non-stabilized tab, and it dissolves very similar. I did some time studies with them, took photos, a lot of great information there, and they dissolve at a relatively similar rate to trichlor, which is what I was looking for. So their brand, or their labeling, I should say, suggests to throw them in the skimmer, like you had mentioned, Steve. And my thought, and a lot of service guys, we come across situations, and not to knock the builders or anything, but we run into situations where I don't want to be pulling tabs out of the skimmer. I mean, that just loads up with debris. We all see it everywhere across the country. The last thing I want to do is be fishing tabs that are half dissolved out of a skimmer basket. So I kind of taken a little bit of a sidetrack, and I'm like, okay, let me see if I can float these. And they fall apart a little bit differently than a trichlor tab. They kind of more crumble apart, where a trichlor tab just dissolves at an even rate down to like a puck.
It's harder as a rock till it gets down to that last little wafer, and it's still hard as a rock.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
The irony, now that you mention how hard a trichlor tab kind of stays and dissolves, I actually tried breaking apart one of these NST tabs. They're kind of shaped like an octagon, or like a stop sign. I tried breaking it on the side of a cool deck, or pool, whatever, and it wouldn't even break apart. It was just rock hard. But what's interesting is they dissolve, they kind of crumble apart. So I immediately realized, okay, these aren't something that you can just float very effectively. But what I did is I took a floater and I cut out all of the like little slits that you see at the bottom where
Yeah,
you
the
can
little
open
vents
and
in the bottom. Sure.
yeah, where you can open and close that blue slider that typical floaters have. I cut all those out, opened up my vents, if you will, whatever those channels are called, opened them up by like 1/4 of an inch. So I had a lot of room there for the water to move and the product to fall out or dissolve. Um, and that actually worked. So, um, again, Lonza does not promote this, so I'm not speaking on their behalf, but it was something that I was able to do. And
I-
actually, it worked really, really well.
In addition, though, you also put a label on that floater that
Yes, I
said, "Don't
did.
put trichlor tabs in there." I forget what your label said. It was a very well done label, and it keeps a homeowner from going to Home Depot or something and buying a bunch of trichlor and throwing in with the cal-hypo. Not a good
That
mix.
that was actually my biggest fear was the mixing of chemicals. I've actually never done it. You know, sometimes you probably should. You should see what happens with two chemicals like that. But I didn't. I didn't really have the balls to see how that all worked. But yeah, I definitely didn't want any mixing going on because these two chemicals are very volatile together. So yeah, I put big labels, said warning, cal-hypo tabs only, and they were a nice sticker that fit around the outside edge. Had these stickers made, round stickers about 7 inches in diameter, so they fit on the outside of a floater. And I found floaters that Leslie's was selling that had a very smooth edge. Some have like a little bit of a texture to them. These seem to work really well for the sticker. They stayed on all season last year.
No,
Some
I have a
faded from
question for you.
UV, but yeah, go
Uh,
ahead.
I have a question. As you put these cal-hypo tabs in the pool and they dissolve, and especially in Arizona where you're probably dropping a half a dozen a week in the pools to get them to hold
Hmm.
for the week, what happens to the calcium hardness in the pool? I mean, does that go sky high, or how do you deal with that?
That's a good question.
Hey, that's what I'm
I'm
here for.
trying. One of the things that's kind of a misnomer is because you are dealing with calcium. The calcium in a cal-hypo is far less concentrated than the cyanuric in a trichlor tab. So
Oh, really?
let me explain that. In fact, I don't have the numbers right offhand. It's been over a year since I really saw or looked at them, but I want to say it's um, I can't even remember, but it's like double the percentage. So like if let's
Yeah,
say for instance calcium 6% in a tab, um, the cyanuric in a trichlor would be like 12% or something like that.
sure. That
It's
makes sense.
higher. Again, don't quote me on those numbers, but it's one of the interesting things that happened because as yes, my calcium did rise, it didn't rise quickly. So to that note, let me talk about something else that I didn't mention, and I know you had mentioned this as far as how difficult it is to switch over a pool. Um, Much of the country, and let's back up a little bit before I speak on the point of the pH of the water. But the biggest thing that I think we've faced is this onslaught of trichlor. And it's not to bash the product. I think the product has a certain place in the industry, certainly on the management of pool water. And I guess what I mean by that, certain areas like Newport Beach, maybe a little bit cooler climate such as Florida, um, can afford to maybe use trichlor in a very managed way. Whereas in the desert, when we have monthly, highs in like the month of July, for instance, where our high is 115, our nighttime low is 100. You're right, Steve. We are burning 5-6 tabs a week, trichlor in swimming pools. And so, again, if you're unfamiliar with the effects of high levels of cyanuric, it's um, Arenda does a great job. They have great videos on discussing this. So kind of let them handle it. But go over there. You'll see how if your cyanuric, your stabilizer level rises, you have to get over that threshold in order to have effective chlorine. essentially your chlorine gets locked up with that extra stabilizer. So going back to my point is,
well, let's go.
I think I kind of wanted to mention the history. So
Okay,
again,
well, real quick, I
it
had
was
the
put into
question
our,
about
go
how
ahead.
did you deal with all the extra calcium in the water?
Oh yeah,
Was
that's
that an
right.
issue? And did you have to do something about that, or was it easy to deal with? I mean, because a lot of guys are going to say, "Wow, all that calcium in the water is going to end up in the tile, and the homeowner's going to be upset."
Yeah.
Was that your experience, or how did you deal with that?
No, sorry. I see where you're going now.
Yeah,
The answer to that is the LSI. So again, Langolier saturation index, if you've never heard of it or you've heard of it and you aren't using it, it is what I would consider the only way to use this product. So the the cal-hypo tab is around a 10, it's like 10.8, almost 11, I think, pH. So you go from a trichlor tab that's 2 to 3 pH in the water, which is very effective sanitizer. You know, it's going to keep your chlorine burning at a very good rate. Also keep your pH in your water lower, which in effect, I think a lot of guys get kind of hypnotized by that. You know, they don't have to add as much acid to their water. Their pH stays relatively low throughout the season. So again, I say that only because not to insult anybody, but I say that because once you switch over to a tab that's pH completely on the other side of the scale at a 10 or 11 pH, you better be ready for that acid. So that was one of the things that was very useful.
sure.
Now I'm not missing the point about calcium. I'm just saying that the pH was a very big factor in the acid demand. Now, why that's important to the LSI is because we want to keep our water balanced. So we want to keep, what the LSI does is it strictly and is specifically for managing calcium in the water. So you're either etching a surface with low LSI, lower than a negative 0.3, or you're putting scale onto the surface, putting calcium carbonate onto the surface of either your tile or your walls at over a positive 0.3. So again, you're using a product that is specifically for the LSI. And I guess I could say that because that's what the LSI is for, is balancing your water. So if you're not doing that and you start to see scale forming because of a product that you're using, you're going to immediately jump and kind of bash the product.
So
But
what you're saying here is if you keep the LSI on like the low end, or at 0 or -1, -0.2 with that area, then
correct.
you're not going to find the tile scaling up. You're not going to find scaling on the plaster or anything like that, because you're managing the LSI correctly. Was there any reason to throw in any sequestering agent at all, or do you do that anyway, or was that necessary in
Yeah.
working the cal-hypo tab?
Geez, you're like really good at these questions this morning.
I
You're very, very good leader.
got up early.
No, you're right. One of the ways, yeah, I mean, I've got pools that I wasn't adding any sequest to that were well over 1,000 ppm of calcium, and I think a lot of guys would be they should be happy to hear that. And that's all LSI based. But yeah, I was seeing some pools like get cloudier from the product, and again, Orenda, great company. They make SC1000. It'll sequest or actually chelate the calcium into the water, so it keeps it in suspension.
Oh, so you're working this thing. You start to see a little cloudy water. In goes the SC1000, their sequestering agent, and that would clear out the water, because that would pull that calcium and hold it in solution, not let it float around. Oh, perfect.
It does. And let me say something too, because there might be people listening that go, okay, that's great. So you're kind of masking or hiding the calcium. No, I'm not. I know it's still there. In fact, I know it's there because I can test for it. So for instance, a lot of times this will happen with all kinds of different things, like phosphate gets tied up with algae. When you kill algae, you get more phosphate. That's something that, people may not quite understand quite as well. But calcium is another one of those things. So if you have calcium on your tile or on your surface that you can see, chances are, well, not chances are, very, like, no matter what, with definite fact, you're not testing that in the water. It's not until it gets into the water that you can actually test for it. So I know that may just be completely obvious, but a lot of people,
Yeah,
they'll
I get
test the
that.
water, and what they have that could be dissolved back into the water could double their calcium. So for instance, if you're losing calcium onto the surface, it's got to go somewhere. So that's why that happens. That's why the whole chemical reaction happens. But let me finish up one thing real quick. Once you get it into, by adding a product like SC1000, and I mentioned this briefly before, that's why I'm draining water, taking care of anything that I can to backwash. Another product that I just never really paid much mind to, never really took notice of, was those big rotary backwash valves that a lot of us probably hate. A lot of us would rather use a push-pull backwash valve as opposed to some of those rotary ones because the spider gaskets can go out, blah, blah, blah. But you can actually, go to waste. You don't have to backwash a pool. Those valves are very, very useful for just dumping a little bit of water. Typically, they're on sand filters, mostly on sand filters, although they are
You can get them
occasionally
on
on
DE
DE.
filters. Yeah, they multi-port valves is what they call,
Yeah,
right?
multi-port.
Yeah,
Yeah, with the big handles that you rotate.
right.
Those, because pools like that are typically designed with a backwash system in place, whether it's a sump pit or just out to the yard, I would go backwash one week, go to waste the next week, so that, if I do need to lower the concentration in the pool by doing that, it's very effective. I've taken pools in the wintertime, I've taken those levels down, not having to drain the pool, just doing it over a weekly basis, kind of like a controlled leak, if you will. I've seen guys on Jason's group post pictures of controlling a leak through just leaving a bleed valve open or something. And, that's one way of doing it. But again, getting back to the product, if you can get it out of the water, meaning by using the water to get rid of it, then you're doing a good service for the water.
Oh,
So
cool.
the LSI is very important on that
I think
product.
that's the key is you got to watch the LSI. You got to manage your pool to the LSI, not to standard range chemistry.
Right.
That's great. So I would just suggest anyone listening that has any more questions for Joe, I would say you could probably just
Find me on
ask.
Facebook.
He's on
Yeah.
Facebook, but you could probably ask a question on Jason Broswell's group, service industry, swimming pool industry workers and pool pros only, and get the discussion going there. Joe knows a lot about that stuff. The other
No, I
one I
appreciate
wanted
it.
to talk to about is, and I've been around for a little while. I haven't been around as long as some people I'm around. I feel like a rookie, and I've been in it for 30 years. So, but kind of the progression of chlorine. And I came into business, tabs were there, and everyone had tabs, and I wasn't always impressed with tabs. You get an instant effect when you pour a gallon of liquid in a pool versus throwing a tab in a floater and throwing it out there.
Sure.
But as we go back in the history, I mean, you go back to glass bottles of chlorine, glass bottle of acid, and then a big jug of copper algicide, and that's how pools were managed. And
It's
that's why when I was
incredible.
a kid, it was just common. If you had blonde hair, it was turning green if you spent any time in a pool
Yeah.
because of all the copper they kept in that water to keep it sanitized. And we are in such a great new world now where you don't have to do that. There's so many other ways to keep that pool clear without having to put copper in, which, I don't know, for me, copper's a heavy metal. It has a cumulative effect on your liver, and why load your kid's liver up with any more copper than they have to? I mean, so what was your experience when you came into business, Joe? Did you
It was about late. It was a turn of the century.
there you are.
It's about 98, 99. So, I mean, a lot of people still think I'm a young buck, but 20 plus years I've seen a lot of change. Some of it not necessarily chemically, but other things. But no, I think the biggest thing for you pointing out the history is very important, because a lot of people think the tabs, the trichlor way of doing things, has been around for eons, decades, since like the 50s or 60s, and that's not necessarily the case. A lot of it was liquid chlorine. I mean, I even remember guys telling me, in fact, up until a few years ago, they were still running around with the gas bottles in the back looking like pest control. And I mean, that I've heard horror stories of, bottles leaking at stoplights and cars shutting down because there's chlorine gas in the air and there's not enough oxygen, and cars are just like
My
dying
God.
at stoplights. I mean, crazy stories like that. So,
Way back, I remember gas shooters, and it seemed, I don't know, maybe I'm just lazy or looking for the easy way, but hauling around a big pressurized tank full of freaking chlorine gas just seemed like a recipe for disaster. And the other thing that chlorine gas would do is it put a big old brown stain on the bottom of the pool, because excessive chlorine will stain plaster.
sure.
And I picked up pools, you look in the deep end, there's this big old brown stain. You go, you had a gas shooter in here at one time.
Got it. Yeah.
And I tried to acid wash that stuff out with varying degrees of success, but I can't believe that. It never appealed to me, but I guess some people swore by it.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any still around. I know there was up until a few years ago. There still very well may be a couple of those guys running around still, but good on them. It's sometimes a very effective way to get chlorine into the pool, but very, very risky product. One that you got to use a lot of control with. But, I think liquid, and then going from liquid chlorine, which is still very, very widely used, great product. One of the things that happened out here was I was using it so much that my salt levels were going up. So a lot of this debate or discussion, I guess we could say, is controlling a lot of the stuff in your water. Like knocking around trichlor like it's in a boxing ring. It's not the best, but a lot of these other products, cal-hypo tabs, for instance, the same thing. You got to know what's in your water. You got to know what levels you have them at, and it's
That's
all
true.
about control. So,
and the use of liquid will put salt in the water. I have some old pools in older neighborhoods of Newport Beach, where when salt first came out and I got my first salt tester, of course, I got to stick it in every pool just to see how much salt's in there. I had pools with water over 20 years old in it. You stick the salt tester in there, it's got over 3,000 parts of
they're
salt.
ready for a salt system.
I just throw a cell on here, and that's all you got to do. Look at this.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's right. Everything you put in there has a byproduct and an effect, and you've got to keep track of that and be aware of it. Because more salt, more dissolved solids keeps blocking the chlorine from doing its job, and that's why old water kind of kills us.
Yeah, it's one of those discussions that some people in the industry. Well, hold on, let me back up. I was gonna say it kind of kills the industry. A lot of what we see is an overabundance to drain pools at somewhat moderate levels, and I guess what I mean by that is we see people just draining pools because their calcium hardness or their TDS is, maybe their calcium hardness is at 500 and their TDS is at 3,000. That's like a perfectly manageable pool under the LSI conditions. So there's a guy out here that I know that does water purification. Steve Ward, little nod to him. That's a great service because you're not wasting water by draining a pool, which is very key. Maybe it's not. People pay a little bit more to have that service done, but they're conserving water. And he does a great job at doing that. So yeah, it's all about maintaining and balancing these pools effectively. And I just took a nod at, hey, I'm going to drop my cyanuric because I know the biggest thing, again, let's like finish that, round out that discussion, is by getting my levels lower, I'm like lowering that threshold or that wall, if you will, that I have to get the chlorine to. So, and some people don't quite understand that point. So if you get your cyanuric down to, if let's say let's like start at 100. I should probably pull up my phone to look up what it actually is. But at 100, your it's called free available chlorine factor. They talk about it. There's a video that Eric Knight put out. That free available chlorine factor is a number that Robert Lowry came up with or put out. It's 7.5%. So at 7.5% at 100 parts per million cyanuric is 7.5. It's real easy. The math there is simple. 7.5 parts per million is what your chlorine needs to be at if you have 100 parts per million cyanuric. So again, most people think 100 is like, okay, that's doable. Like I've seen it higher, I've seen it much lower. So if you go lower, obviously, let's say by half, 50 parts per million, now you're down to about 3.3, something like that, parts per million.
3 3/4.
3 3/4. So that's where your parts per million chlorine now has to be. So that's why there's such a discussion about this, because a lot of times people are like, you know what, I can't hold on to enough chlorine at that level. It's not necessarily that you don't have to hold on to that much chlorine. It's how much chlorine can effectively kill anything in your water. So I think it's great because I got pools that are, let's say 25. So then you drop that in half. Now you're down to around, less than 2 or right around 2 parts per million chlorine. Well, the amount of chlorine that takes to maintain is far less than maintaining it at a threshold of 7.5. So that's where this whole discussion is very useful, just to point out those facts and that information, if that makes sense.
I agree. And there are some great videos on Arenda. Eric does a great one on free available chlorine. I've seen it. So cool. Yeah. I think we kind of covered this topic.
No, it's been a good conversation. Yeah, one that I think a lot of people will benefit and understand. And if they've never heard some of these numbers or information, yeah, we're very happy to get that out there.
That's very good. Well, I want to tell everyone to keep checking out our podcast. Plug it into your ears while you're working. You don't need to see the video. A lot of mornings I feel like you shouldn't see the video, but yeah. Check it out or kick it around, and we're going to keep going. Well, thanks for your time here, Joe. Enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, you too, Steve, as always.
All right. We'll check out in the next one.
Thank you. Bye.